So welcome everybody to our webinar entitled Parades in the Year of COVID, Russia's Commemorations of World War II in 2020. And this webinar is hosted by the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. And even though we'll be focusing on last year's commemorations, both aspects of the topic, I think, remain timely and pertinent. Last week's Victory Day is still fresh in our minds, and COVID, alas, is never far from our thoughts either. So I'm not going to say too much. We have a full roster of speakers. Today with us, we have Matthew Blackburn from Uppsala University. We have Alexandra Arkhipova from the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. We have Ekaterina Klimenko from the Polish Academy of Science, and Maria Matsyuk from the Sociological Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and as our discussant, Misha Gabovich from the Einstein Forum. My name is Anthony Kalashnikov. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the International Center for the History and Sociology of the Second World War at the Higher School of Economics. So without further ado, allow me to introduce the first speaker that we have today. Matthew Blackburn is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. He completed his doctoral thesis on nationalist discourses and the imagination in post-Soviet Russia at the University of Glasgow in 2018. And his recent publications include Mainstream Russian Nationalism and the State Civilization Identity, and Political Legitimacy in Contemporary Russia. Later this year, Matthew will be taking up the ULAM Visiting Research Fellowship at the University of Warsaw. So the floor is yours, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you all for agreeing to join us in this event. Really excited to hear my colleagues' presentations today. I start with the big picture, and I will apologize in advance if I have to rush through certain aspects, but I will hopefully give us a good start before the more rich detail of the other participant presentations are conducted. So today, I start with a picture of Vladimir Putin standing in front of the Rizhev statue that was commemorated in June 2020, and this is the final speech prior to the elections to approve amendments to the Constitution on the 1st of July. Of course, I think it goes without saying that in Russia, the commemoration of World War II has a higher degree of intensity than perhaps any country in the world. And for many observers, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's about political legitimation, that it's about boosting ratings, it's about mobilizing supporters, it's about holding things together. And I suppose many observers will also say that in 2020 and 2021, there's a new pace to this and a new depth to this. But I leave that as a question rather than a statement. It's suffice to say that using 1945 as a foundational myth or a means of patriotic mobilization, this requires a constant struggle to update it, to make it relevant and to maintain its significance in a diverse and changing society. So I'm going to start in a rather strange place, perhaps for some people, by talking about memory and political legitimation very briefly, and say that we, of course, have a previous model of the use of historical memory for political legitimation. And that, of course, is the 20th century. That is, for example, the USSR, which had two foundational myths, 1917 and 1941, that were extensively commemorated, extensively referenced to in street names, in history textbooks, and were held together as part of an all-encompassing ideology that had an answer to virtually all questions and was propped up and organized by a totalizing party state, by which I mean a party state that had ambitions for every sphere of activity, of social life. Today, things are, I would say, very different. Russia's most usable past is 1945, but it's not a foundational myth because, of course, the foundation of the Russian Federation is 1991. How to make it into a foundational myth is a challenge. It hasn't been completely done. We don't have an all-encompassing ideology like the 19th century, 20th century predecessors. We have a national identity narrative, which is used in different ways. And there is a patriotic kind of coalition with certain ideological red lines, one of which is World War II memory. And we don't have a totalizing party state, one-party state. We have electoral authoritarianism, which allows for far more freedom and pluralism than the previous model. Often when we look at World War II commemorations from an outsider perspective, from outside of Russia, I think there's a temptation to see the previous model of the 20th century, but I think we have a constant challenge to reformulate what is going on in 21st century context. I'm going to skip by this slide. We don't have time to go into more theory, but I think we're all familiar with the steady evolution of World War II commemoration in Russia from 1995 onwards as the most usable of paths. I think it's been well covered already. I'll move through this fairly quickly, but suffice to say, what are the key reasons for this? The strong consensus on this being the most important event in Russian history is backed up in polling. You don't need to only look at polling, you can have conversations with people in Russia, everyday conversations. You'll find this idea that this was the war for the survival of our homeland, and not necessarily linked to venerating the state, but certainly the strong consensus on the sacredness and importance of this victory. And there's a bottom-up dynamic to it in this period. The St. George's Ribbon, the Immortal Regiment, these are grassroots movements that have been later co-opted, but they come from the people, in inverted commas, from below. It's a successful means of creating shared values across generations and cultural divides. It is the one thing that could unite Russians, despite, as I already mentioned, the diversity of that society, regional, cultural, socioeconomic, and generational. And finally, well, it's the most meaningful of public holidays, because if you compare it to the November public holiday, which the June Independence of Russia holiday, the May the 1st holiday, it doesn't have the same meaningfulness, obviously. People were making it meaningful before 1995, even in their own homes. And this continues to go on. On the one hand, it is still a private sacred event that people have in their homes. On the other hand, it's become something of a mass carnival, combining elements of Soviet nostalgia, military traditions, all of which are about promoting the unity of the people and the state, bringing the state into the equation, whereas before perhaps it was an individual private celebration of a chapter of family history, which is very real and personal. And the state has increasingly pushed itself into this picture. And of course, Maria will look at the question of how it resonates more than I will be able to today. 2020 is the 75th anniversary of World War II, and there were particular celebrations planned for this. There was the international level, particularly large foreign delegation was planned. There was a particularly large budget. There were initiatives in the post-Soviet space. On the national federal level of Russia, there was, of course, the typical presidential PR activity, which I'll look at today. There was to be a new level of immortal regiment activity. And all the major ministries of Russia had developed initiatives to celebrate the 75th anniversary. On the regional local level, of course, governors and mayors, I think where we don't have the paperwork to demonstrate this, but they're expected to create their own PR events as well. And the regional outlets of major ministries also were active in making plans, which I'll come back to later in the presentation. And of course, there was this patriotic mobilization. A lot of volunteers were expected to be involved in this kind of 75th commemoration on all levels of Russia, from the village all the way up to Moscow. So finally, of course, the ambition of 75th anniversary thing, it comes through in the documents and the planning, is to make sure that every individual goes beyond their private family commemorations to get involved in some contests or events or online actions or even going to museums, all of which will join the individual up to their community in some kind of event to commemorate World War II, which again, as we've said, is one of the big unifying things. Okay, I'm almost finished with the context, but 2020 also, we must remark that 2020 is a particularly important year for the development of what we might call the Putin system. Why? Because after 2018 and the pension protests, at the beginning of a ratings problem, sporadic protests in the regions in 2019, and the national projects which were refocused attention onto them in 2018 after the presidential election in 2018 were flagging, not making particular much remarkable progress. There's economic stagnation, and of course there's the lame duck problem of Putin's terms. All of this leads me, at least, and I think Katya also is agreeing with me with this when we're having discussions about it, to see Victory Day in 2020 and the 75th anniversary within the context of a larger plan. The government reshuffle of January, the announcement of the amendments, agitation for the amendments, a referendum in April, May Day celebrations, Victory Day celebrations in May, followed by extensive extra additional events that will carry through June, perhaps all the way to the end of June, then regional elections in September. And so I would leave it hanging in the air that the 75th anniversary commemorations are within the context of a larger plan to reboot legitimacy, boost legitimacy, and re-secure a degree of stability and move attention to some desired directions away from the previous problems I have in this slide. Of course, COVID came and in March, and so only the first stage of that plan was carried out the way it was planned. And instead, when we got through March and April and May, Russia was under lockdown, and the Kremlin was robbed of very large-scale stage-managed events. The actual May the 9th celebration was a very muted affair with Putin. It was a rainy and grey day as well, if I remember correctly. And in fact, Lukashenko upstaged Putin famously by having a full-scale parade in Minsk on the same day. And I remember that very much. It was a period where everything had to be rescheduled. And of course, the referendum was rescheduled to the 1st of July. And that's why I pay particular attention on a number of rescheduled and re-planned events which were held in the last 2 weeks of June. A very busy June for World War II commemorations, in spite of the fact that the May the 9th had already passed. On the 18th of June, there was the release of this article in National Interest, whereby we're put in a long, rambling piece, pushed back against the efforts of historical revisionism to lay the fault of the origins of World War II on the USSR and Nazi Germany equally. Then on, and I think we'll just make a small point here about how that's a reaction to things going on in Poland. In fact, Poland also, we have officials and politicians starting to use World War II commemoration as well, the 75th anniversary. So I don't have time to unpack that, but that was a response to things going on in Poland, largely. On the 22nd, as Katya will expand upon this, Putin visited the newly consecrated main cathedral of the Russian armed forces with Patriarch Kirill and Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. On the 24th, the cancelled May military parade was then held with a dramatically reduced number of foreign dignitaries. And then on the 30th, we have the bottom slide where this Putin was joined by President Lukashenko for the opening of this statue of Rzhev. The Battle of Rzhev is a brutal and bloody encounter between Nazi and Soviet forces that had been largely ignored in Soviet-era commemorations. And this was the end of June's activity. And if you open up the speech you'll find it on YouTube, just before the 1st of July, the speech that he makes, Putin, this is where he really does pull it all together and show that the World War II commemorations are very much linked to the agitation in favor of the constitution. And whether that was a decision made in 2019 or whether it was made in March during COVID, we don't know, but I would lean towards the former, that this was originally planned to combine the images of World War II with patriotic sentiment and voting in favor of the constitutional amendments. Moving on then to, I have to be very quick, and I can't obviously talk in detail about how. I hope that Maria will take up this question of how the population would have responded to yet another major commemoration event when so much on the ground has changed and so much chaos, economic and connected to COVID and connected to also questionable state performance and capacity in battling COVID in 2020. How all this played out, I think, would be a fascinating question to come back to. But moving away from the federal level, the presidential-centered kind of viewpoint, I would like to just look. I only have time to look at one oblast today, and this is the only regional level that I've looked at in detail so far. An interesting thing that I discovered, well, I think it happened previously as well, but this plan of regional level activities and attractions and events that would be held in 2020. These are not activities that necessarily cost a lot of money, but the range of them is quite interesting to read out as a list. We need more ethnographic research, of course, to unpack how successful this regional patriotic mobilization is, or how it looks like when it's actually implemented. But looking at the list, there's photography and book exhibitions, there's the opening of new monuments, there's monthly thematic meetings, such as there where there is memory, there is pain and tears, or another title of the meeting would be Real Men Serve the Fatherland. There were Spartakada of working collectives, there were kind of sports activities for various working collectives, entitled The Meeting of Three Generations. There were children's clubs, musical performances, Diktant Победы, which is the dictation event. There was an event entitled George's Ribbon. I'm not sure what happened there. Volunteer groups cleaning up and marking the resting places of veterans. There were all-city Sobotniki, and there were also quest games, Quest Igra, the Paths of War, which I would imagine is targeted at teenagers. I mean, all of this looks at an effort to engage all ages and bring all different kinds of people together around World War II commemoration. I can't say at this stage how uniform this was across Russia's diverse regions, how far it reflects top-down Kremlin directives, and how much of bottom-up innovation there is here. I think it's a fascinating area for further research. But of course, this level, this committee-led level, which covers all different parts of the oblast, was then also combined with what Governor of Novosibirsk Oblast, Andrei Travnikov, got up to around this period in June. And again, I think it's safe to say that Governor Travnikov is one of the classic examples of a parachute governor. He is appointed in first into a place he has no background in. He has no background in Novosibirsk. He's from Cherepevets, as far as I remember. But he is parachuted in as an appointment governor, and then within a year and a half or so, he wins an election and to sort of secure his place. And Travnikov is one of the ones who shows very keen awareness of the ideological priorities in 2020. I don't think all governors were like this, but one of the key events, that PR events that were going on in June, was the awarding Novosibirsk the status of heroic city of labor. I've tried to translate that from the Russian, Город трудовой доблести. If I've translated it well, I don't know. But 20 cities were awarded this by a special historical commission. I don't know if any cities were rejected. But the whole contest, in inverted commas, was played out into the referendum campaign, agitational campaign. And I've got a picture there that says Izhevsk, because I can't find one for Novosibirsk. But what happened was the governors of certain governors of these 20 cities, I don't know if all of them did it, but they added a second box to tick on the voting yes for the referendum. So you vote yes for the referendum or no. And then you have a box to tick, do you vote yes or no to making Novosibirsk, giving the status of heroic city of the back line to Novosibirsk. So some people might be thinking, you know, what would there be any interest in this? Is it so high profile? It is the most high profile thing that Travnikov did in terms of state media activity in June. And his brief agitational campaign was then followed up by a news report where Putin, in his kind of style that he often was in 2020, very tired and disinterested and just reading out in a very bored way, he read out the list of all the cities that had been awarded this. And then right after that, Travnikov spoke himself with very kind of vigorous words and lots of patriotic rhetoric. So what is all the televised loyalty is on display in this particular incident? And again, reveling in the glory of Novosibirsk World War II exploits, sending a special thanks to those who performed heroic tasks, and then linking that up with what I have in the previous slide, all these different events that are going on across the region. So we have a big regional PR thing. There, the very bottom left picture, we have the top brass of the regional authorities in Novosibirsk Oblast, all together, none of them wearing masks, I should say, which has been a strange feature of 2020 when we see top politicians refusing to wear masks because it's not, I don't know, it's not manly or it's not the done thing. But anyway, huddled together in one shot, all of this brings me moving on to trying to discuss, yes, we can see World War II being used as a legitimation tool on a federal level, presidential level, on the regional level. There's a sense of trying to push belonging, patriotism, national unity. That's the aim. And if we want to show that the government and the state are united with the people and the Russian people, then World War II, in this sense, it does act like a foundation. It could be like understood as a foundational myth. It could be understood as the most usable past, whatever term you prefer.
Sorry, of course, to interrupt. You're at
last slide.
So, yes. Okay.
Last slide. So to wrap up, World War II commemoration, I don't have time to cover this side, but it has another side, of course. The repressive laws that have come out, the fact that a lot of World War II language has been enshrined now into the Constitution, and there's a very much a sense that it's propping up an identity project. The laws that have come out of rehabilitation of Nazism have been bolstered in 2021, and so it appears that there's an aim to sort of remove from the public space any discourses that would highlight state failure or that would rupture the unity of people and state around World War II memory. And any focus on state violence against the people, that is not welcome, of course. And that's what we are struggling with at the moment, is to understand these latest developments, which are more repressive, about patrolling the ideological boundaries of what is acceptable, what you can say and what you can't say about World War II. And of course, we don't have time really, I have to finish now, but I hope we come back to the question of are we on the verge of some kind of ideology? Is this a proactive movement that will result in some kind of state ideology? Or is this purely defensive measures by a regime that feels embattled? That was my final point on my slide. And I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it today, but it's where I'll finish now. And I'll thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your presentation. Next up, we have Alexandra Arkhipova. She's a senior research fellow and head of the Contemporary Folklore Monitoring Research Group at the School of Advanced Studies in the Humanities in the Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. Her research interests include the study of political jokes, rumors, legends, and the folklore of protest. And she's the author of several books, including most recently Dangerous Soviet Things, Urban Legends and Fear in the USSR, which was co-authored with Anna Matsyuk, and which won the Liberal Mission Prize for the best analysis of current events. Take it away, Alexandra.
Hi to everybody. Can you, sorry?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Good. Okay, good. One more sec. And thank you for inviting me. And I guess now it's okay. It's working, and finally we have my slides, and okay, now I know what is going on. My battery is very slow. Sorry for that. Yep. So today I'm speaking, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the possibility to discuss what's going on the last year. And today we're talking about the Russian Victory Day online. This is our collective research, and our team researched Victory Day last, I don't know, 5-6 years. So we conducted surveys, interviews, participant observation on Victory Day since 2015. So, and because in 2020, all the usual official activities were prohibited, so we decided to organize a survey by the methods of snowball in the internet to discuss how people celebrate this day, or if they did celebrate it at all. We conducted this survey we have a little bit more than 600 respondents. Here you can see on the slides the basic demographics characters. Of course, this survey is not that representative as it should be according to the sociological surveys, but this material, this data allows us to compare which practices were more popular and which were less popular. I should mention that in previous years, one of the most popular commemorative ritual on the May Victory Day was immortal regiment, where people carries the portrait of the dead relatives who were participant in the Second World War. And this is the main civil and commemorative ritual in today's Russia. And in 2020, the Russian authorities suggest a big set of practices. According to these practices, Russian citizens should participate in a mortar regiment online. For example, you can send a picture of your veteran to the special website. Also, you can post a video in social media or perform a song and a poem and made a recording and also put it in internet, and even also you can lay in flowers online to the portraits of veteran. Kids were making such pictures in kindergartens. You can see this on screen. And also there is a list of offline practices you should do at home. For example, like displaying portraits of participants of the Second World War in windows, hanging the flag of the USSR or modern Russian flag in windows, decorating windows with thematic inscriptions and children drawings, singing war songs from balconies, and so on and so on. So there was a official set of suggested online and offline practices. And our goals was the follows. We decided to research which family and civil practices was most popular in the situation of COVID. And that's why we ask our respondents to describe their participations in all these big set of practices and which of them were more acceptable and suitable for them, and which they approve or not. So there's a big list of practices and a big list of questions, open and closed questions, and we're asking about these practices which should be taken place in the border of the public and home personal space, like to put the portrait of the veteran in your window. Also, we ask about traditional memorial practices in public, say, like wearing the state George ribbon, visiting mass graves, laying flowers and memorials, and all this, which was officially banned. Also, we ask about family practices of online remembrance, and like, for example, displaying, posting some information online, something like that. And also we ask how people react to these official practices and how they feel about it. So in general, 35% said they did not celebrate Victory Day completely. The remaining 55 in response to the open question said that they just made a lot of family practices. For example, thanking commemorating old relatives, veterans, son of the veterans, home front workers, kids of war. A lot of people said that arrange a family dinner. They gathered relatives and they raised a glass. It's very interesting that well, it's not a big percent, of course, but 1.5% of informants said that they specially arrange a minute of silence in their families. Here you can on the screen you can see quotation from the interview. Also, which is quite interesting, many informants was saying that in addition to the ritual dinner, they devoted this day, Victory Day, to the search the additional information about their relatives who were in war. And they feel that their responsibility is to find this information and to talk about it to the younger relatives, especially in this day, like you can see at the quotation on the screen. Going to some results. For example, you can see here how people participate in these new online commemorative rituals. And it's very interesting that in this survey, we ask ask a respondent if he or she ever participated in immortal regiment. And how many times she or he participated in the immortal regiment in the previous years. And there was a great difference between those who already participated in the immortal regiment in the previous years and between those who never did it. As you can see at the table, the main result is that all these new online practices of commemoration, like publishing a picture of veteran in the social media, posting St. George ribbon as an avatar, or put the picture of the veteran as your avatar in the social media, and so on, were quite more popular among those who already participated in the immortal regiment. Those who were not participating in this ritual in the previous years, they were not involved in all this almost completely. Also, it's very interesting that those who already, so these participating or non-participating in the immortal regiment really create the social and reality around you. So look at this table. There was a set of questions we were asking if you see flags in the windows, portraits of the veterans in the windows, if you see war songs from balconies and windows, if you noticed all these online commemorative practices, which was strongly recommended by Russian authorities. And according to this table, it's very easily to see that those who already participated in some ritual activity in previous years, they too much times bigger saw these activities. Once you participated in immortal regiment, you start to see all the signs everywhere. So I guess I'm out of the time already. So according to going to jump into conclusions. So our data, and I should mention that we're not conducting, we were not only conducting survey, we're also making interviews. So our data shows us that there was no agreement how you should celebrate Victory Day in general and how you should celebrate Victory Day in the time of COVID. Many practices which were popular the previous years uh, uh, without support and extreme mobilization from the authorities lost their popularity completely. The only popular practices are these individual family rituals, like to share personal stories about relatives with the kids, make a family dinner, watch movies about war, and something like that. The predictor that allows to predict whatever some Russian is going to participate in public commemorative ritual suggested by government is not a factor of age directly, but the factor of previous participation of in immortal regiments. Respondents are most likely inclined to to performative remembering of their ancestors if they already tried before COVID. So that's what I'm going to say in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Alexandra. Next up, we have Ekaterina Klimenko. She received her Candidate of Sciences degree in Cultural Studies in 2010 and is currently a PhD candidate at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Her research interests include the study of nationalism and the politics of historical memory, and her latest publication appeared in the journal Nationalities Papers under the title Building the Nation, Legitimizing the State, Russia, My History, and Memory of the Russian Revolutions in Contemporary Russia. Ekaterina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for the introduction. And well, I'm used to saying thank you to the organizers of the event, this or that event, but in this case, since I'm one of the organizers, I want to thank all the participants who agreed to join us in discussing the topic, which I think is timely, as Anthony already said. I will share my screen with you. Okay. So this issue that I'm going to talk about today, it's a part of a bigger project that is funded by Polish National Science Center, and it's focused on the study of Russia, My History, historical parks. But this particular segment that I'm going to be talking about today is new to me. So please forgive me, and all comments and questions are more than welcome because I'm really starting to explore it, well, basically right now. And I wanted to discuss the so-called the Patriarchal Cathedral in honor of the resurrection of Christ, also known as the main cathedral of the armed forces of Russia. Matthew has already mentioned it today in his presentation. It was on your screens. You can see how what it looks like on the outside and on the inside. It was planned to be consecrated on 9 May 2020. Vladimir Putin was supposed to be present at the consecration ceremony, but due to COVID, of course, everything was postponed, and the cathedral was finally consecrated on June 14, 2020. Putin did not take part in this ceremony, but Patriarch Kirill, of course, performed the consecration, and Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, was present on site. Putin did attend the cathedral a week later on June 26th, the day of remembrance and sorrow, again, the day of the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. Again, Sergei Shoigu was present, and Patriarch Kirill said a short prayer. The construction of the cathedral had been announced only 1.5 years earlier on 4th September 2018. So it was really quickly developing project, so to speak. It was supposed to be funded through public donations, but in the end, it was paid only partly. It was paid for only partly through public donations. The fund that was created specifically for managing the construction received 3 billion rubles from these donations. 2 billion rubles came from the Moscow budget and almost 1 billion from the budget of the Moscow region. The cathedral is not the only thing that appeared in this area, because it is surrounded by the multimedia museum complex, which is called the Road of Memory. The museum is the gallery of 35 immersive halls. It takes exactly 1,418 steps to walk through this museum. 1,418 days is the number of days that the Great Patriotic War lasted. So it's not, this number is not by accident. On display in this museum is the history of the Great Patriotic War, and according to the website of the museum, an authentic atmosphere of the war is created there, and a visitor can live through the war from the tragic events of the beginning of the war until the triumphant entering of Berlin by the Soviet army. The idea of, living through the experience of the war may seem strange to some of us, but nonetheless, this is what the creators of the museum are promising to its visitors. The whole thing, the museum and the cathedral, are located in the Military Patriotic Park of Culture and Leisure of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. It had been opened on 16 June 2015. And the idea to create this park, as well as to create the museum, as well as to create the cathedral, to build the cathedral, belongs, according to official rendering of this event, belongs to Sergei Shoigu. Among those who participated in building the cathedral, the most often cited figure is Vasily Nesterenko. He is the people's artist of the Russian Federation. His mosaics became notorious prior to the consecration of the cathedral. Those are the mosaics where Stalin and Putin and Valentina Matvienko and other leaders of Russian incumbent elite are depicted. But to me, the more important and probably more interesting figure is the chief architect of the project, Dmitry Smirnov. Dmitry Smirnov was also the architect of the Church of the Resurrection of Christ and the New Martyrs and Confessors of the Russian Church, the cathedral that is located in Moscow in Sretinsky Staropygic monastery. And Dmitry Smirnov is a collaborator of Archbishop Tikhon Shevkunov, who was the abbot of the monastery back then. Now he is Metropolitan of Pskov and Porokhov. Dmitry Smirnov was also, and still is, the architect who created the chain of multimedia historical parks, Russia, My History. So he cooperated with Father Tikhon again on this project. The symbolism of this cathedral is more military than religious, actually. This is what is in a way striking. So for instance, the cathedral is located near the village of Kubinka in the Moscow region. And according again to the official narrative of the cathedral and its creators, on the spot where the cathedral was founded, a milestone had been discovered. And this milestone marks the exact place where the Soviet troops began their advance to the west in 1941. Nazi tank tracks were used to manufacture the stair that leads to the cathedral. The main icon of the cathedral, the holy image of the Savior not made by hand, it's painted on wooden panels, traditionally for, of course, for icon painting. To manufacture these panels, a gun carriage of a 18th century cannon was used, and metal parts come from a forend of a Tokarev automatic rifle. The central altar of the cathedral is named after the resurrection of Christ, but the four side chapels are dedicated to the heavenly patrons of the army branches and services. The crypt is consecrated in the name of Saint Vladimir, the baptizer of Rus. And finally, there's symbolic numbers that are very important for the creators of the cathedral. The act of capitulation was signed at 22:43 p.m. on 8th of May 1945, and this is all encrypted in the dimensions of the dome, the cupola, the height of the small dome, and etc., etc. So what is particularly interesting to me in this cathedral and in the whole project? Of course, we could say that this is just an odd bricolage, right? And an odd combination of religiosity and militarism. Nothing new about it, because the church and the state has been cooperating in various fields for quite many years, and this is just another step in their cooperation. So nothing particularly new or interesting here. However, what I think is quite surprising is that the Russian Orthodox Church began to cooperate with the state in memorialization of the war. It is something new indeed, because the church's memory project has always been focused on the memory of the Soviet terror, more particularly on the memory of the persecution of the church in 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So why now this new endeavor to commemorate the memory of the war? Another question is why the Kremlin is seeking some kind of symbolic support from the church in its war-centered memory project, because up to now it has been instrumentalizing the memory of the war quite ingeniously and quite efficiently. So why turn to the church now today for help, symbolic help? And I think we cannot just, shrug off this project as some just new step in an old process. I think it's some kind of new development that needs to be studied. And to approach this question, or these two questions, I think we need to remember that the idea of the two memories of the war. One heroic memory focused on the victory and papering over, so to speak, the price of this victory. And the other, the so-called memory from the trenches, the alternative version, which focuses not on the victory itself, but on its price, on the suffering, the hardships, and the crimes of the Soviet regime against its own population, against populations of other countries, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and so on and so forth. And it's very difficult to marry these two memories. And it's impossible to forget the second one, since the revelations about the war came to the surface in 1990s, and it's now not so easy to, paper them over and completely kind of remove them from the public eye. So in the 1990s, the Russian ruling elites tried to reframe the memory of the war, and the official narrative became that the Soviet people managed to win the war despite the Soviet leadership and all the atrocities and all the crimes of the Stalin regime. However, this rendition, this narrative does not go well with Putin's quasi-ideology, which is statist, of course. So they don't go, this anti-Stalinist rendition of the memory of the war, anti-statist, anti-regime rendition doesn't work very well with the current historical narrative that the Kremlin is producing. So what I think is happening with this cooperation of the state and the Kremlin in memorializing, in the memorialization of the war, is the introduction of the concept of martyrdom. And martyrological memory is exactly the memory that allows to glue together these two memories of the war, the heroic one and the one that is focused on suffering, death, and victimhood, and so on and so forth. And of course, the institution or the memory actor that, so to speak, owns martyrological memory is the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, not only in the general sense of the word, because the very phenomenon of martyrdom belongs to a Christian tradition, of course, but in a very practical sense, because the memory project of the Russian Orthodox Church has been focused and has been founded upon the memory of new martyrs and confessors of Russia. New martyrs are believers, clergy, and laymen who suffered for their faith in the early Soviet years. In 2000, nearly 2,000 of them were glorified by the Russian Orthodox Church, and the church has been doing quite a lot, actually, to promote the memory of them, not only among the believers, but also among the general population, so to speak. And in fact, the whole project, Russia, My History, grew in a way from the attempt to promote the memory of new martyrs and to, advertise it, so to speak, among not only Orthodox believers, but among people who are very far away from the church, from believing, from practicing Orthodoxy, and so on and so forth. What is also important is that memory of new martyrs has religious meaning. This is, well, not surprising, right? Martyrs in Christian tradition, they testify their faith through their suffering, but it has also a secular one. And according to it, those who fell at the hands of the theomachist Soviet regime not only testified their faith, they secured the future resurrection of the church from ruin. They provided for Russia's religious revival. Well, this is not very surprising, right? But what is surprising, they laid foundation for Russia's reestablishment as a great state. This is, well, official narrative of the Russian Orthodox Church, because it is reflected in Patriarch Kirill's public addresses, sermons, and so on. So in a nutshell, new martyrs and confessors of Russia fell not only for their God, but also for their fatherland, and praying to them saves the fatherland, not only the soul of the believer. This is something new, I guess, for Christianity, this idea, which is now being developed by the church. Patriarch Kirill stressed it in 2017 during the consecration of the aforementioned Church of New Martyrs and Confessors in Sretensky Monastery, and he said, glorifying the new martyrs and confessors of Russia, we pray that through their prayers, God kept our country safe from the libeling of its enemies. So praying to new martyrs is actually not so much about religion. It's more about patriotism and love for Russia. Martyrs in this rendition, in this interpretation, they mediate not so much between man and divinity. They mediate between individual and the state. And this is, of course, the narrative or the interpretation of the concept of martyrdom, which is quite beneficial, politically beneficial for the regime. One of the key motives of this martyrological memory is, of course, purification by blood sacrifice. So the narrative of martyrdom gives sense to suffering. In more traditional narrative of the church, it gives sense to the suffering of those who perished in the Gulag. But this actually can be reinterpreted and is reinterpreted today. This narrative.
Sorry to interrupt. You're out of time.
Oh, okay. So just to conclude, few more sentences. So this memory, it draws attention away from perpetrators, draws attention away from the crimes of the regime. It gives sense to the suffering of the victims, and it is applicable not only in the case of victims of the Soviet Gulag. It is also applicable in the case of victims of the war. And this martyrological narratives allows the regime and the church to join their forces in producing this very beneficial narrative of the war, which actually does not contradict memory of the trenches, but uses memory of the trenches for political purposes. And I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation, Katerina. Next up, we have Maria Matsyuk. She's a senior fellow at the Sociological Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. Her recent work has been on memory of the Russian Revolution and the Second World War in Russia and post-Soviet states, with an emphasis on survey data. The floor is yours, Maria.
Thank you, Anthony, and I'd like to thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to participate in the webinar. And please take my apologies for not preparing a true presentation, as I've had my arms broken for a few months, and that's why it's especially difficult to create presentations. It's easy to write down something, but very difficult to take slides. So please, again, take my apologies for this. And I still like to present few pictures from the recent survey, very recent surveys conducted in May, just few days ago, about the Victory Day and its meaning for Russian people. And I'd like to make just few preliminary notes about the memory of the Great Patriotic War in Russia and its dynamics, its changes over the years. Just to start, the Victory Day, the 9th of May, is the most important holidays for, have been for many years, the most important holiday among the state holidays. Of course, the New Year holiday is again one of the most popular, but the New Year is a private, is a family holiday, while the Victory Day is the most important event for most of Russian people. And whatever wording or a question form we use for our surveys, whether it would be close-ended or open-ended question, the answer would be the same and would have been the same. It is the World War II or the Great Patriotic War is the most important event in history of Russia, or the Soviet history for surveys conducted in late 80s, 1980s. And basing on other historical events and attitudes towards them, one could expect a huge generational cleavage in terms of the Great Patriotic War attitudes, especially as time goes on. And for most events and the names of people from the history of the past, that could be true. Yet for the memory of the Second World War, we can see no difference in attitudes in Russia, unlike post-Soviet states, by the way. And for instance, I'd like to share some slides. Hope you can see them. Well, a second. Well, I hope you can see them. The first picture is their data from May 2021. This is the representative sample for Russia. This is their age groups and the attitudes toward the most important holidays in Russia. And you can see that on the average, their Victory Day, the 9th of May, is the most important event. Of course, there are some difference according to age groups, but still there is a huge gap between their Victory Day and all other state or official holidays, except for the New Year, of course, the 1st of January. And for instance, this is the picture from their 2020. And this is again the representative sample for Russia, face-to-face interviews, and the most important historical event or the event from the past of Russia, their victory in the Second World War. It is seen as the most important event by the overwhelming majority of Russian people, up to 90%. And again, about the generational gap that we could expect to see, and in fact, we don't see any difference, huge difference in age groups, in attitudes towards the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War. They are always the same. Just a second. Yes, I stop sharing. Just a second. Yes, and again, what is important for us to note about their memory of the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War, that many people, especially young people, they think they do not know exactly or for sure some historical facts or dates from the history of the Second World War. And they believe that the majority of the immediate environment, they also do not have a strict knowledge, strict historical knowledge of the history, including the history of the Second World War. And the younger people are the more likely they admit their ignorance or poor knowledge of history, including the history of the Second World War. This is not at all inconsistent with the fact that they, young people, like the older generations, they consider the World War II a sacred event. Moreover, young people consider the Victory Day even more like popular holiday, народный, popular holiday. They consider it as a popular holiday much more often than older people. Most older people call the Victory Day a state holiday. Not popular, but state holiday. They have a choice between a state status of the holiday and the popular status of the holiday. But of course, we need to remember that all the people have in mind that the state nature of the holiday gives it more significance, more importance in their mind. For instance, we know that many papers, volumes included, for instance, that edited by Misha Gaboich, we've discussed recently, provide cases, observations, and evidences that there are no so strict boundaries, dividing lines between official and private stuff in war memory today in Russia. And many people, including young people, they appropriate the war memory and rituals and ceremonies, consider them as their own rituals, and they take the language. Of course, they change it in some way, but nevertheless, they use so-called official language to describe their feelings and their attitudes towards the event, the Second World War. And about the immortal regiment and participation in the immortal regiment, Alexandra told us a lot about their some evidences about the feelings towards their immortal regiment. What would I like to stress? That after COVID came to us, and the immortal regiment parade moved online. Paradoxically, lockdowns have contributed to the less official understanding of war memory and of Victory Day commemoration by young people in Russia. In Russia, young people are still more likely to be internet users, and therefore they are more inclined to express their feelings through social media, and they are online with their memories and the pictures of their relatives, on their great parents, and so on. And by the way, we could see this year, not only in 2020 but in 2021, we could see most of us who have Facebook accounts, we could see their parade of relatives' pictures demonstrated or posted by so-called liberals. So in this case, we could see that political polarization did not affect so much the memory of the Second World War. And what I would like to say again, that the Victory Day is, of course, sorry, to put it in another way, the Victory Day scholarship has described lots of reasons why the Immortal Regiment and other official commemoration of the Victory Day became so popular among ordinary Russian citizens. And among those many reasons, I would like to make an emphasis on one moment which is less frequently mentioned. There's a lack, not to say an absence, of unifying symbols in today's Russia. And especially young people still feel the need for solidarity and for being a part of a community. And millennials and young people, younger than 25, let's say, they have a high level of interpersonal trust, and they are more likely to work and act together. And still, they feel the need for being united with some other people in some activities. And for instance, charity and volunteering are just few examples. And on average, and this fact is in a sharp contrast to other age groups. For instance, older people, they have much lower level of interpersonal trust, and they need to be a part of some activities, common activities. And they also demonstrate the much lower level of generalized trust, which includes interpersonal and institutional trust. And for instance, only 1/3 of Russians feel other people or strangers can be trusted, while 2/3 take an opposite point. And this is quite opposite to the data from the European Value Survey, which is revealed twice higher level of trust, about 60% in some Western European states like Netherlands, for instance, Iceland, and some others. what I would like to say that in Russia, many people lack their interpersonal trust. On the one hand, they feel like they can't trust other people, especially strangers. On the other hand, they feel like they need to trust. They can't, but they need to. And this is one of the reasons why people demanded their symbols which can unify them. And unfortunately, we have lesser number of unifying symbols either in the past or in the future. And it turned out that only the Second World War and the Great Patriotic War, they could provide such a pool of unifying symbols. And what is again important about this new culture of memory, of war memory in Russia today, is that right now we are witnessing the new emerging culture of war memory. And what I would like to say that many Russian, not only Russian, but mainly Russian memory scholars, cultural entrepreneurs, museum workers, historians, mnemonic actors, we are old enough. We met real war veterans. We watched Soviet movies, and those movies were made by those who fought in World War II. And of course, we can remember and neglect that Soviet official style of commemoration, of war commemoration. But at the same time, we need to take into account that our sensitivity to false and vulgar nature of some state memory rituals and ceremonies, at the same time, the new generations came who grown up within the new memory culture and knows nothing but this way of commemoration that we have seen for the last at least 20, or yes, about 20 years. And these new generations and younger age groups, they feel like this way of commemoration of the Second World War is true popular way of commemoration. And Soviet movies, songs, fiction and non-fiction literature are not anymore as influential source or reservoir of symbols as they used to be for Soviet older generations, which I belong to, for instance. And young people, millennials, sometimes can see false parts of rituals of war memory rituals, but at the same time they can ignore these parts and consider other things more important, more close to their private and their private feelings. And to conclude, I would like to say that many scholars tell us right now about civic religion based on the Second World War memory in Russia. And unfortunately, there are no other common unifying ideas and symbols in our history or in our present or in our future. And the students of the Victory Day in Russia point at religious connotations as Katya, for instance, did. And there was a nice note made by one observer of their commemoration on May 9th this year, that the Immortal regiment is close to a religious procession where everyone has her own savior or saviors. And of course, this is an important part which can't be neglected by anyone who would like to promote the political agenda or political views or make any influence on people's minds. And
sorry to interject.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Yeah.
This is the last sentence I would like to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation. So without further ado, we'll move to the comments by our discussant, Misha Gabovich. Misha Gabovich is a senior researcher at the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. He was editor-in-chief of the journal Неприкосновенный Запас and founding editor-in-chief of Laboratorium, Russian Review of Social Research. His recent edited volumes speak directly to the topic that we've been discussing today. These include Monument and Celebration, Ethnographies of Victory Day, which was published in Russian last year, and War Commemoration as an Event, May 9th, 2015, in Post-Socialist Europe, which was published in German back in 2017. Take it away, Misha.
Anthony, and I'll try to set my own timer. So as Anthony just said, I have published a number of things on ethnographic observations of Victory Day, not only in Russia, but also in other countries. And this was this came out of two large collective projects that I co-directed with other colleagues. And if you're interested in looking at the output of those projects, I can direct you to a section of my website, which you can see here, which lists not only those books, but also various articles in various languages and videos, etc., that came out of this. So my comments will be based on sort of my dual role. First of all, as a sociologist who has engaged in these kinds of ethnographic observations, but also as a historian who has looked at the history of Victory Day and other military commemorative practices in the Soviet Union, specifically in the two post-war decades between 1945 and 1965. And if you ask me in both of these roles to say what I think are the big picture developments in kind of the evolution of Victory Day, then I would point to two things. The first is generational change, right? And this is extremely important. And it was mentioned to some extent by Maria and also briefly by Alexandra Arkhipova in her presentation, but I think it needs to be stressed even more. So what we know from our observations in a variety of different settings is that the main carriers of commemorative practices, not only in Russia, but also in other post-Soviet contexts today, belong to the grandchildren's generation, right? So those who are most active in developing and maintaining these kinds of practices, be it the immortal regiment or any number of other things that you can observe in provincial Russia, but also in other post-Soviet countries. These are the grandchildren of war participants who have often a kind of romanticized relationship with their grandparents, and for whom it's also extremely important to pass on a certain commemorative culture that they remember from the late Soviet period to their own children. This is the first point. And the second point is the international dimension. And this was hardly mentioned by anyone, actually. And I think, one of the most important points about Victory Day today is, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that we find commemorative practices relating to the Soviet victory in the Second World War, not only in Russia, but also in every single post-Soviet state, one way or the other, but also really around the world, wherever you have even small communities of emigres with post-Soviet backgrounds. So for example, you will find immortal regiment processions in dozens of US states, in Australia, in Germany, in Israel, and many, many other countries. And of course, this means that you can no longer think of Victory Day exclusively as something that's happening in Russia, or that's something that is controlled by the Russian state. And I think Matthew alluded to this very briefly, but of course, everything that's happening in Russia, not only on the level of official memory policies, but also often on a societal level, is also in some ways a response to what is going on in other countries, right? Especially in neighboring countries, but also internationally. And this concerns not only memory wars about the right narrative to adopt, about the history of the war, but also practices that develop elsewhere, and which, unlike what is often claimed, are not just projections of kind of Russian mnemonic soft power to other countries, but which often are developed kind of to make a point in the societies where people live. So, based on that preamble, I would be a little bit critical of the way that Matthew framed the discussion at the very beginning. So, Matthew, what you said about Russian state policy and the importance of the Second World War and commemoration of the 75th anniversary for the legitimacy of state power is, of course, extremely interesting and extremely important. But I would take issue with the idea that that is really the big picture. That kind of everything else needs to be grafted upon, because I do think that these macro developments in terms of internationalization, but especially generational dynamics, are in a sense more important, and it's the state that responds to that rather than society that is being successfully or less successfully being led by the state. So I would kind of object to this kind of political science lens as the guiding principle that we should all adopt. And this, this leads us to kind of a number of points or observations. So usually the way that this is approached in kind of journalistic or political science discourse is that, Putin and the Russian state has kind of rediscovered World War II memory as an important legitimating tool. And then we need to see the extent to which this has been successful in Russian society as a whole, in individual regions, etc. And then we can sort of go into smaller case studies. And as you said, Matthew, we can engage in ethnography to see the extent to which these kind of mobilizing offers from the state are really being kind of successfully swallowed by the local populations, right? And what this is really is kind of a hydraulic model, right? Where you have top-down pressure and then a kind of bottom-up response. And what I've tried to suggest in some of my publications is that we really need a more complex approach to the diversity of agents who are engaged in commemorative practices. And I think Maria's point about the diversity of mnemonic agents who are really the carriers of this commemorative culture is extremely important here. So what would be an alternative to this kind of top-down versus bottom-up view? Now, what I would suggest is that what we've seen really not just in the past 20 years, not just since 1995, but really in the entire history of Victory Day since 1945, is kind of an unequal dialectic between the state and society, whereby the state, of course, sets a very strict kind of ideological and propagandistic model, a kind of framework in which it expects people to engage in commemorative practices, and which, of course, it kind of tries to mobilize constantly for its own legitimating practices. But then people come and take these offers up in all sorts of unexpected ways. And within that framework, start developing practices of their own, right? Which are not purely kind of grassroots bottom-up practices, because they do start with things that are being offered to them by the state. But in the process of taking them up and kind of running with them, they also modify them, right? And I mean, we can see in the history of Victory Day how this led to the kind of Victory Day that emerged starting in 1965 onwards, based on practices that for the previous 20 years had been developed in places like Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, etc., and which were then kind of homogenized as a nationwide cult under the Brezhnev regime. But we can see this also in the more recent examples that some of you have mentioned, and I think the Immortal Regiment is a great example of that. So it's become kind of commonplace to say that the Immortal Regiment has been co-opted. And I think that's a very imprecise way of referring to what has happened, because it's a practice that was launched in 2012 by, as most of you know, a group of critical journalists from Tomsk who wanted to individualize the repertoire of commemorative practices in Russia. And of course, it's been, in a sense, at least in Russia, though not everywhere in Russia, and certainly not to the same extent in other countries, been taken up and very strictly framed by state institutions. But in the process, it has also changed the commemorative repertoire of the state, so that now it is no longer possible for Putin simply to stand atop the mausoleum and watch the parade. He has to, either participate in the immortal regiment himself with the portrait of his father, or, engage in some sort of more individualized practice, such as, for example, speaking in front of the Rzew Memorial, which is a wonderful example of this kind of more individualized practice, because it has this these long lists of names. And the Rzew Memorial itself, of course, is also a very good example of that, because one of the reasons, I believe, why this was developed with the kinds of resources poured into it that we've seen was that previously a grassroots initiative led by a local museum director led to the creation of a different memorial in the same region, to the south of Rzew, namely in the Smolensk region, the Bogoroditskaya Pole, which was also a battle that was essentially taboo in Soviet-era historiography. And then in the post-Soviet era, this local director of a literary museum basically kind of campaigned and lobbied the authorities to create this essentially grassroots memorial, but which ended up also getting rubber stamped by the state and getting state approval. And I think one of the reasons why this bigger memorial in Rzew was created was a desire to sort of overshadow these grassroots practices with something that's more strictly controlled by the Military Historical Society, right? So I think that we really need a more complex understanding of the dynamics between the different actors involved in military commemoration in Russia, but also in other countries. So it's not just a matter of the population responding to something that's being presented by the state. It's a much more complex development. So what Ekaterina told us about the creation of the cathedral in Patriot Park, I think is a very good example, because of course you can't just portray the Russian Orthodox Church, or the army for that matter, as kind of appendices to the state that simply do whatever the presidential administration tells them to do. Of course, they're integrated into an authoritarian political system. Of course, they have good reasons to want to show their loyalty to that system. But in the process of participating in a kind of set of commemorative practices that is being framed by the state, they also end up modifying that repertoire. And this happened with the creation of the Federal Military Memorial Cemetery that I've worked on a little bit, which was essentially an initiative by a bunch of Russian generals, which then ended up being adopted as the new Russian National Cemetery in Russia. And I think Ekaterina's example of the cathedral is also a wonderful example, because now if you want to speak in religious terms about military commemoration in Russia, and a lot of people are doing that even if they're not really part of the church community, then you have to start adopting this language of martyrdom that that has been really developed by the church and adopted in a sense by state agencies. So some of the presentations also, I think, raise interesting questions about the generational dynamic, right? So I mean, Maria, for example, talked about the way that there's no difference between the ways in which younger people and older people, even though I wasn't entirely sure about the age cohorts that you were referring to, that they see World War II. But to me, the question would be about the extent to which younger people will actively engage in certain kinds of commemorative practices when they are not prompted to do so by older family members, right? We know from research about opinion polling in Russia that, of course, in a lot of settings, people will respond exactly the way that, they think they're expected to respond. And of course, given the importance and the dominance of World War II commemoration in the Russian context, it would be very surprising if younger respondents in these surveys said, well, I don't care about World War II, it doesn't matter, I don't participate in anything. But I think this is where it would be really interesting to combine the kind of research that Alexandra Arkhipova has done, looking more precisely at the kinds of commemorative practices that people engage in, and the link between perception of the, the spread of commemorative practices and people's own involvement in this, with the kinds of things that people will say in surveys. And I think that if we compare what's happening in Russia with military commemorative traditions in other countries, then my expectation is that gradually, as the grandchildren's generation over the coming years and decades will also start fading away, military commemoration will become more and more specialized, right? So even though now a lot of younger people will, of course, respond in surveys by saying, well, yes, this is extremely important, this is sacred, this is the most important event, etc. I think that what we will see in the coming years and decades is something like what we're seeing in the United States with Civil War memory, where essentially the most active commemorative activities are carried by a relatively large but still minority group of people who have a particular specialized interest in these kinds of things. Reenactors, people who are very actively engaged in the immortal regiment, the poiskoviki who look for unburied bodies in the woods and the swamps, people organized in the Russian Military Historical Society, etc., etc. And then, on holidays such as Victory Day, some of these practices will be shared and will be engaged in by larger groups of the population as a whole. But outside of those dates, I think this will become less and less central to people's lives as we see another wave of generational change. And I think it would be really interesting in the future to combine these kinds of large N surveys with more targeted ethnographic research, not in order to see how people respond to kind of what the state wants them to swallow in terms of ideology, but to see what meaning people actually find in these commemorative practices and how it relates to their own family dynamics, right? And how they relate those family dynamics to bigger things like, national identity, Russia's place in the world, etc., etc. So I think those were my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Misha, and thank you to all the panel participants for a fascinating discussion today. Unfortunately, we have one of our participants who has another engagement right after this, so we're going to allow them to answer any questions first. So if anybody has questions for Alexandra Arkhipova, please either raise your hand through the raise hand feature or write it in the chat. And in the meantime, Alexandra, if you would like to respond to our discussants' comments in any way, please do so.
I would love to, but I couldn't see them.
I guess just any type of response to the oral comments that Misha gave, but if not immediately come to mind, we'll just give a few minutes for our participants to write something through the direct message, or in the meantime, I suppose I could ask, I mean, you talk about the immortal participation in the immortal regiment as the best indicator of participation in Victory Day commemorations in the time of COVID. And I was wondering, why is it such a good proxy? Do you have any working hypotheses for that?
I'm sorry, it was a question for me?
Yes.
Sorry, somehow I missed the contact of the question.
Well, I suppose you were talking about the immortal regiment and participation in the immortal regiment as a particularly good proxy or predictor for participating in commemorations in
yes.
Victory Day under COVID. And I was wondering if you had any working hypotheses for why it's such a particularly good predictor.
Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Because once a person was organized to perform some ritual act, he convinced himself and people around him that it's good to publicly present his memory. So in that case, he is going to proceed this even in the time of COVID, because he considered this to be sort of sacred act. And many people, they respond exactly in this style. This is a sacred act, and we should keep it in any way. And such person can easily see such rituals around him. On the first screen, on the first slide of my presentation, there was a replica phrase from some online chat. And this replica, in this phrase, it was said that it's a shame that they didn't allow us to celebrate Victory Day. They didn't allow us to organize the Immortal Regiment. It's a shame that we are not going to be part of these commemorative rituals. It's a big problem for people who already was involved in that.
Right. So the answer is more on the level of individual worldview rather than commemorative networks that were formed during this movement or not. Okay, thank you. So do we have any further questions for Alexandra? If not, then we'll move on to maybe a 1-minute response at most. Unfortunately, we're so pressed for time. To Misha's comments. And in the meantime, while the speakers are responding, please feel free to write a question in the chat or to raise your hand. So we'll go in the order of the speakers. So Matthew, if you have any response to the discussant comments, you have 1 minute.
Certainly. I think I would respond very positively to Misha's comments because this hydraulic model is a very crude rule of thumb, which we start with to open the discussion. What we're looking for is a way to incorporate these very diverse and very dynamic, whether you want to call them grassroots or actors that are interpreting different kind of patterns and making their own imprints on these processes. I absolutely agree. And I think the macro developments we have to also include them without we can't become too state-centric, and I think we have to also not fetishize this kind of legitimacy kind of research question. It's only one part of this picture. And I would just want to also say that, a recent example that I found was at Mechta Veteranov, which is a new kind of slightly newer kind of thing that started by Yaroslav Salyutin in Crimea. And this is a fantastic example of collecting money from ordinary people to make a veteran's dream come true, fix the ceiling, or buy a refrigerator, or something like this. And again, this is a great example of what Misha's talking about, unexpected ways that these kind of groups form and are trying to transmit some of the values and ideas from their grandparents and as Misha says, the grandchildren of veterans or World War II generation. And I think it's fascinating to look at these cases as well. And I do agree with Misha's point that we, in a more pure way, would be better not to shall we say, foreshadow our questions and our investigations with this whole idea of legitimacy and resonance. I think it's a very good point. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Katerina, do you have anything to respond with? Or?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Misha for very interesting comments. And the one that was addressed to me specifically is about this interrelation between church memory, so to speak, and official memory. And what happens when they come together. I do not know about this church yet, but when I look at the project Russia, My History, I can say that when the state is incorporating the church's initiative into its repertoire of political manipulation of the past, the church narrative is becoming more statist and more nationalist, not vice versa, not the narrative of the state, the official one, is becoming, churched or orthodoxized or something like that. So it remains to be seen, I would say, in response to that one. And I'll stop here.
Maria, would you like to respond?
Yes, I would like to join the other presenters and thank Misha for his inspiring comments. And what I would like to add that, yes, that's a very important point that we need to pay attention to the generational difference and to what younger people do while they are commemorating. And there are just one point to say that, of course, there are many, not only surveys, but interviews with younger people and focus groups with them. And what one can discover during this mixed method research, that the young people we have their very common or general problem for all generation, that we have no specific language to discuss public issues, public and political issues, and the language that the official bodies or the state, so-called state, provides us, that's the only language we have to express our feelings or meanings or thoughts about public or political issues. That's the problem for the Russian society, I would say.
So thank you all for your responses. We have a few comments and questions in the chat, but first of all, I'm going to go to our first commenter question, Olga Malinova.
Yes, I'd like to comment shortly. Thank you very much for organizing this seminar. I'm sorry I could not be a part of this discussion from the very beginning. For these reasons, I won't comment to everybody. Just 3 points that are, to my mind, very important. First, I think that it is very interesting to look what goes on with the memory about the Second World War now, when the entangled, embodied memory of those who had this experience goes away. And I think that the presentations of today's seminar demonstrate pretty well how the Russian society, different groups of it, make efforts to commemorate, looking for some new ways, looking for some new meanings, etc. And I think that this is a very perspective for research, because it is very important to look empirically on what is going on and not to rely too much on our previous knowledge, because I believe that a lot of things are changing. My second point is to Katya Klemenko. I've posted a link to the conference in European University in St. Petersburg, which we held in autumn last year. There was a presentation of Daniil Anikin, who picked up the same topic. And the translation of the sections is available taking this link. I also included the link to publication, but this collected volume collected only part of presentations from the conference. And as I can see, Daniil hasn't published in the volume. But I suggest Katya to follow his publications, because they have a grant and they really need to publish. And I believe that he will probably publish it in some journal. Just it's the same topic, and he did some field research and he collected some interviews, so he's very close to what you are doing, and I think that the best thing you can do is just to be in touch with him. And my last point is that looking from the perspective of states memory politics on how the Second World War is commemorated, I think that again we need to control our expectations based on some, I don't know, theories or knowledge about how authoritarian Russian state is. Actually, all commemorative practices involve multiple actors, and different actors participate with different aims, and there is always interaction. I'm much more convinced in it now as we started our project we devoted to studies of memory politics at regional level. And we can see how the same state projects launched by the Federal Center, like historical parks Россия моя история, how differently they are dealt with at regional level. If you look, for example, on how the local part of the exhibition is run, who is involved in creating this exhibition, how it is done, you can see that it really varies from region to region. In some regions where there is an active expert community, where there are a lot of historians who are running local history, where there is good teams in I don't know how it's in English, Краеведческий музей.
Local history museums.
Local history museums. You can see how creating this local regional exposition becomes really not an autonomous project, but important part of the general project. So this is not only about the church and the state. This is also about local regional actors who run these parks. And by the way, the fact that now the parks are given from the federal budget to regional budgets also changes a lot of things. So I would say that historical parks is rather, how to say, rather vivid project, which goes, well, which has some dynamics. And we should not consider this project from our previous knowledge that was relevant for 5 years ago. Now it's many things has been changed. And it's very interesting to study because it is strictly about memory politics. It's about interaction between different mnemonic agents who have their own visions, etc. So even if we take,
I'm afraid that the panel time is drawing to a close.
So I stop here. Thank you.
Sorry about that. There's another 2 questions in the chat. So how about I take them as well, and then if we'd like to respond to that, then perhaps we can conclude the panel 5 minutes late. I would like to ask whether anyone ever researched the practices of pranking related to the immortal regiment. Such things are normally done by young people. So first question, and second question. Thank you all for a very interesting seminar. I have a question regarding digital spaces and online celebrations and commemoration practices, especially among young people. From your own experience, what are the key Victory Day practices in digital spaces? So once again, we could go in order if you would like to respond to these questions or Olga's comments. Matthew, take it away, but we are over time already, so please keep it brief. Matthew, if you feel like you don't need to respond right now, if any of the other speakers, Ekaterina, Maria.
I'll go last because I have another question I can
sure.
If I may, I just think that both of the questions from the chat are very important, and probably Alexandra Arkhipova would be best placed to answer them. But unfortunately, she has left the discussion already. But I'm pretty sure that her group has collected a lot of data on both of these things.
Actually, I'm not aware of any researchers about the pranking practices of immortal regiment. Of course they are, but I have no idea how widespread they are. About the second question about the online practices of young people, I would call maybe just a few. Of course, Alexander would have mentioned more of them. The first one, of course, is some groups and posts with relatives or great-great-parents pictures who participated in wartime. And again, the playlists on YouTube with military songs, with some moments from war movies. And again, TikTok is a place where many young people place the video with some words to addressing them to veterans and so on. So TikTok and social media of Kontakte, Russian social media of Kontakte, they are places where we can find a lot of such groups and evidences of digital commemoration of the Victory Day.
Ekaterina, if you have anything to add.
Well, I'm afraid both questions are a bit outside of the scope of my research. The only thing I could remember is that last year, pranking of the online Immortal regiment, when someone, I believed, posted among these pictures of veterans of the war, posted a picture of Himmler or Goebbels. I'm just some of those guys. This is the case that I remember, right? But unfortunately I'm not familiar of anyone who would do a thorough research of that case. I guess that's one of the responses that we've been mentioning today, right? The new generation can respond to this official mnemonic practices in various ways, including this one.
Yes, just to build on this question of digital spaces and the different practices that are going on, as Maria says, it's a very diverse space where you can find all kinds of different things going on. And I do think we have to keep in mind that on the 9th of May is a very special period, and there's a lot of things that will go on there that are not reflective of a wider processes, as Misha mentioned, that we are not reflective of how people behave for the whole year. And so we have to be careful about how much we extrapolate out of that. Because one way to look at that, one way to see evidence of that, not looking at digital spaces, but look at traditional space, like a film, making a film about World War II. And there was the film Zoya that was released at the end of January, and the very mixed reaction to that film, I think, and very bad reception in the box office. People didn't want to see it, right? And contrast that with, I believe, another film called Dyatlov, is that correct, the name of the film, which is much more successful. And it's taking on the Hollywood kind of model of the action film. And taking a lot of these ideological elements out to an extent. I haven't seen both films, I have to say, disclaimer, but I think that this is where we find interesting comparisons. We can look at the digital spaces on the 9th of May, but then we can look at, outside of that, how people respond to things that are not connected to the actual Praznik itself. Second point I really found, I just want to just build on what Maria was saying. I think this is a really key area, and I'm really fascinated with it, is about unifying symbols. And in a postmodern context of the West, to suggest that there are more powerful unifying symbols in societies like the United Kingdom, Belgium, Sweden. I find that very fascinating. Just kind of, do we have more in the West or less? I'm not sure. So therefore, where are the countries that have lots of good unifying symbols? Is it Turkey or Iran or something like this? I don't know where we're looking, but I'm not sure if it's the West. I think the West is moving away from this kind of thing. And so I just think that's a very good point that you made, Maria, and I wish that we would have that. I wish I had that in my big picture at the beginning, because we have to remember there are lots of countries in the world, and Russia's not the only one, obviously. And what they do is not always, anyway, I think that's a very interesting point. So I'll stop there.
So I think I'm afraid that we're going to have to bring this webinar to a close. We are over time, although I think that testifies to the scope of this topic, which is very great, and also to the interest that we've garnered. So thank you again to the panelists for the fascinating discussion. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope that our audience did as well. So